I work with the Rare Books collection, and I also co-curate the World of the Book exhibition, which is in fact housed right around the dome here where we are. Now, the exhibition is closed at the moment, so we thought it would be nice in a way to take a little bit of a tour around and show you some of the terrific things on display currently. So the first case we're going to look at is one that I found really exciting to kind of put together because it touches on the whole idea of banned books, restricted books, the whole notion of books being kind of subversive and dangerous. When I first came to work at this library back in the 1980s, there was a kind of rumour of a secret collection locked in the chief librarian's office. I never saw it, but a couple of years back, when I was working in the Rare Books collection, I came across 3 or 4 shelves of books that didn't kind of relate to the books around them. And I started to realise that most of the books had the word sex in the title. And I kind of suddenly realised that, here was that secret collection. And for the first time now, we've been able to actually put some of these books out on display. We find books on nude photography, obvious candidate, but equally, there are literary high points of the 20th century. James Joyce's Ulysses in first edition. Now we find racy novels as well, like The Revolt of Mamie Stover from the 1950s, D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is a banned book in Australia, and there's a poignant note in the copy of J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, pointing out in fact that this had been withdrawn or prohibited by the Commonwealth censor. It's wonderful in a way this collection was kept. Each of the books at the time had a symbol on the spine, and we can actually see it behind me here. It's a cross with 4 dots in each of the quadrants, and that indicated books that were put into a restricted collection. We're lucky in many ways that this library has kept its collection or still has it intact as it was, because in a way it provides a window for us to look back on a time when books were considered dangerous perhaps, subversive, and needed to be just locked away from prying hands and curious minds.
One of the really wonderful things about the World of the Book exhibition is the way in which it helps us explore the global history of writing, of text, of reading and sharing stories. And one of the most special things in the exhibition is the oldest item in the library's collection, which is this cuneiform tablet. It's a clay tablet that's about 4,000 years old, and it has on it a script that's known as cuneiform. That comes from a Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge, and it refers to the shape of the implement that made the marks in the clay. Cuneiform script comes to us from the ancient culture of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and it represents one of the first times that humankind used marks to represent thoughts and sounds. So it's a really incredible moment in time captured here, showing us a leap in thinking, from thoughts becoming sounds and sounds becoming signs. It's a really romantic, to me, really evocative and wonderful part of the library's collection, but it actually also has a quite mundane purpose, which is that it's a tax receipt for taxes paid in sheep and goats. So the next great step in the story of humankind's relationship with writing and text comes the form of the scroll. And the scroll comes into being because of the invention of different types of writing surfaces, and one of them in the ancient world was papyrus. And papyrus as a writing surface is really flexible. You can make lots of sheets and stick them together, and then the best way to organize them at that point was to turn them into a scroll, join them together and attach them to rollers that allow you to turn and access the script. So the form of the scroll then is a huge innovation. In Judaism, the Torah scroll is always written on vellum, so prepared animal skin, not papyrus, but the technical form of the scroll remains the same. Another really important and ancient writing surface is the palm leaf. Palm leaves were used for writing in subcontinental Asia for many centuries, going back as far as the 5th century BCE. You can see 2 examples here, one much bigger than the other, both though made from palm leaves. So palm leaves are long in their dimensions, rectangular, and that's the reason for the shape of these books as you see them here. It's also important to note that they're not bound, the leaves are not stitched together. Instead they're stacked and they're kept between heavy wooden, very beautifully carved boards to protect them. So the form here of the palm leaf has become really important in a particular religious tradition of Buddhism in that part of the world. So much so that you see that when printing comes to this culture, and you see 2 examples of printed leaves of Buddhist texts on the wall here, the form is retained, the form of the palm leaf. Even though these are now made of paper, which can be made to any shape really, They retain the shape of the palm leaf because of that ancient evocation of Buddhist spirituality that has become associated with that particular writing surface and form. So from the scroll and the palm leaf book, we now find ourselves looking at the Roman form of the Codex. We're so familiar with the form of the book in this guise that we maybe don't realise quite how revolutionary and special the form is. It's known as a codex, which comes from the Latin word deriving from tree trunk, and that goes back to the earliest form that gave rise to this idea of a codex, which is wooden writing tablets covered in wax that were used by the ancient Romans. In time, these wooden tablets would come to be stitched together loosely with cord as a way of storing them and making them more easy to use. And over time, that evolved into what we see now as the bound form of the book, a real revolution in how people could access information and ideas. This particular book that we're looking at here is one of a number of medieval manuscripts the library holds, which is the largest public collection of medieval books in Australia. What's really exciting about it is that it contains music that is performed, in this case by a group of nuns in the 14th century in France. What we can see on this page is the text and the music that celebrate the feast of St. Lawrence. Lawrence was a martyr in the early Christian church, but before he died, he was famous for having collected and preserved the archive of his early Christian community. And for that reason, he's celebrated today as the patron saint of librarians and archivists. But he is perhaps better known for the gruesome way in which he died, in that he was condemned to be burned alive. He was placed on a griddle and had the presence of mind and the humour enough to apparently quip to his tormentors, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." So the form then of the cuneiform tablet has durability on its side. Once you make them, they last thousands of years, but you can only record a certain amount of information on them. The form of the scroll then allows you to record a lot more and keep it together, but there's a limit to how easily you can access those ideas once they're in the scroll. So the Codex completely revolutionised how people can read. You can have lots of information contained in one place, you can flick backwards and forwards through it, you can have an index. The whole world shifts when the form of the Codex is embraced. And it's for this reason that it's still such a durable form today, 2,000 years after the Romans pioneered it. Once the Codex takes off, the form of that binding itself becomes a really beautiful area of book art. And we see here some wonderful examples of fine bindings from the 17th and 18th century. These are all from the John Emerson collection, which was the most important and significant gift of rare books that the library has ever received, which came to us in 2015, and it was a bequest by John Emerson, the Melbourne QC and book collector. So these are all wonderful examples of the art of bookbinding, which involves meticulous use of tools for stamping, gilding to create that wonderful illumination that you see, and of course the use of fine leather itself. You also see beautiful examples of book clasps, which by this point are not really necessary. Clasps exist initially because medieval manuscripts are made of vellum, which is a very springy material that bounces in humidity, springs open really easily, and so clasps were needed to keep books tight and secure, keep them closed while they weren't being used. By the time you see books like this being made in the 17th century, they're made of paper, and they don't need to be clasped together in the same way because paper doesn't react to humidity in the same way as vellum. But they're still there because they've become an integral part of the art of the book. One of the really wonderful things about the World of the Book exhibition is that it lets us look at the traditions involved in the history of the book, but as living traditions, because our relationship with reading is of course not over. We continue to evolve and adapt how we read. And although for many of us a lot of reading takes place in the digital sphere these days, there's still a very strong relationship that we all have to physical forms of reading. And I think a really great illustration of that is the way that we haven't left behind the concepts or the terminology of earlier forms of reading. Many of us own a tablet, we scroll through information, we turn pages of ebooks. And artists too continue to respond to traditions of bookcraft and various forms of the book. This wonderful work by Cowley Stillman, which is called the venation. The word refers to the pattern of veins on an insect's wing or a leaf. And you can see here that Cowley has with incredible skill and delicacy, carved the form of a leaf's veins into the foredges of a stack of books. In this way, she's of course making a reference to the leaves of nature, the leaves of a book, but also to a different way of reading. And it's of course even more interesting when you go around to the back of this work and see what the books are that Cowley has used. Romance novels picked up from an op shop really cheaply. And there's a really fascinating relationship there between the content of these books, which now isn't being read, and their forms being turned into an artwork that is read in a different way.
One of the books we've got on display in the World of the Book exhibition is John James Audubon's Birds of America, and it's spectacular. It's one of the great treasures of the library's collection. It was published between 1827 and 1838, and it contains 435 very, very large engraved plates of American birds, all hand-coloured, and it's just a sumptuous item. The reason he used this very, very large format, which we call double elephant folio, is he wanted to actually produce the birds life size. And when we look at some of the water birds and this pelican on display here, we can see that they even now just barely fit on the page. Audubon issued the work in parts to subscribers. So you'd subscribe to the book, and each couple of months you would get 5 plates of birds, and you would continue to collect over the 11 years of the project. And at the end of that time, you would presumably have them bound by your binder, generally in about 4 volumes, which is what the library set is bound in. So this is 1 volume of 4 that we hold. Now this copy has a really interesting backstory. A few years back, a colleague of mine, Brian Hubber, started to investigate where this copy actually came from. We found an old card in the library's old card catalogue, and on the back of it, it said Barry, meaning Redmond Barry, the library's founder, offered Audubon for £200. He thinks it's too much. And then beneath that, it then said Barry bought for £100. So in 1871, this book, under Barry's tenure at the library, entered the library's collection. Now it turns out the book was actually owned by a gentleman by the name of William Stallard. And he had come out from London, where presumably he'd acquired the work, across to India, then to Tasmania, and eventually he settled in Victoria. He ran a number of private schools in Geelong and Ballarat, and he sold the book to the library in 1871, I suspect through financial hardship. Sadly, after that, William Stallard's life went downhill. He was dismissed from his teaching position in the early 1870s. He turned to drink, and we find a newspaper report in the local papers from 1882 telling us William Stallard committed suicide by drowning himself in the Yarra. So in a way, it's a sad end to a life which is linked to this book. But I find it kind of odd and strangely comforting in a way to think that we actually remember William Stallard for this book he once owned, which is literally seen by hundreds of thousands of people who visit this library each year to look at it.
Books have always been used as a way to share ideas and information across time. And the 3 books that we're looking at here in the World of the Book exhibition are all works that are about the natural world. So they're scientific in one sense, but they're fascinating to us today because they contain information and images of animals that we know to be mythical or legendary, but at this time they're being presented as real animals. And the reason for that is not because people were more gullible in the past, but because in the past people were often recording information that they'd received by word of mouth. People weren't able to travel the world in the way that we can today, and so they were reliant on information coming to them from different sources. Sometimes that would be an actual specimen, but more often than not it would be either a drawing or a description of an animal. And here in these books we see 3 wonderfully mythical creatures. We see unicorns, in the middle the manticore and the mermaid all have their origins in ancient civilizations in the Near East, and the knowledge about them came through to European culture through the Greeks, through their recording by historians such as Pliny and others who wrote about the natural world. So the Greeks are describing these creatures, and through the texts that they created, the animals found their way into the medieval bestiary tradition. The bestiary is a collection of texts and images of animals that explain the animals and their purpose in the natural world, but also in an allegorical sense. They give meaning to these creatures within a Christian framework. So, for instance, the mermaid is often depicted with a mirror and a comb, admiring herself, combing her long hair. She's a symbol, therefore, of vanity, also of pride and luxury. But sometimes she's also used as a symbol of eloquence, so it wasn't all bad for the mermaid. And in this wonderful 18th century example of a mermaid here, we see her with arms outstretched, reaching out for a hug, but beware of the mermaid's hug. The manticore is a creature that goes back to ancient Persia. The name comes from the Persian word for man-eater, and it's a creature that has the head of a human, a body of a lion, and a tail with venomous spikes. The human head, however, has 3 rows of savage teeth, and the manticore was believed to devour its victims whole, leaving no trace at all, not even the bones. This example here from a mid-17th century book by Edward Topsell, an English clergyman, shows the manticore with a very well-groomed coiffure and beard, probably quite familiar to gentlemen's grooming trends of today. And the unicorn that we see in this wonderful book from the mid-17th century is a creature that has a really long history of allegorical significance in lots of different cultures. In Christianity, it becomes a symbol of Christ, and the imagery of the unicorn with its head in the lap of a virgin, it was believed that only a virgin could capture a unicorn, becomes an important allegory of the Virgin Mary and her mystical marriage with Christ, her son. So these are creatures that become symbolic in many different ways across time and place. And by sharing those stories, these books bring us into contact with different ways of seeing the world.
One of the themes we've focused upon in the World of the Book exhibition this year is around the idea of the photo book in Australia. Now, the term photo book's a very recent term, which was really coined in the 21st century, but it's come to stand in for a whole historical series of books, predominantly around photographs. I mean, it's arguable in the sense that when Anna Atkins and Henry Fox Talbot, back in the 1840s, were using photography in books, they were creating, in fact, the world's first photo books. And in a sense, it's the question of what do we mean when we talk about a photo book? One of the definitions, in fact, is the idea that a photo book is a work by a photographer in which they actually use photographs to sequence and edit to tell a kind of narrative or theme. There have been attempts in the last 15 years or so to actually start to build a canon of the great photo books through history. And the predominant work is the one by Martin Parr and Jerry Badger, which is a monumental 3-volume history of photo books. Now, Parr and Badger barely mention Australian photo books. In the last few years, an Australian photographer, Doug Spout, and his partner Vicky Cooper, have started to actually create a list of what the key photo books are. And what we've done is put a little series together here based on their work, which shows some of the key photo books produced in Australia from around about the 1960s through to the 1980s. It's been a fascinating journey for me in particular to really start to think about these books, which were not considered significant or major in some ways. And what we find are really seminal works. For instance, Carol Jerram's book, a book about Australian women, published in 1974. And this was the sole book produced by that renowned photographer prior to her early death at age 30. And we also see on display works by Yass Desai's Craigieburn, It's Not the Same, a series of portraits of people the Australian Indian filmmaker and photographer met on the streets of Craigieburn, or Ying Ang's prize-winning photo book Gold Coast from 2014, which looks at the darker side of the Queensland region, or May Lee Hunt's Let's Eat Cake, which documents the nationwide Australian marriage equality movement and its ultimate success through the 2017 plebiscite. The library actively collects photo books today, both as a way of documenting what's being produced and published, because many of these are produced in very limited editions by the photographers, but also we want to capture something of the innovations and practices of this really exciting field of publishing and book history.